Across 5 Aprils by Irene Hunt. Day 6. Chapter 6. Matt did not sleep the night after Jethro's return from Newton, and the next morning he was up at dawn moving aimlessly about the cabin and out around the dooryard and woodlot. Ellen had managed to sleep a little in the early morning hours, but she got up when she heard him and prepared a breakfast that neither of them wanted. They drank a little coffee and looked at one another in silence. She noticed that his face was pale, but so was the dim light in the cabin, and so, she supposed, was her own face. A moment later, though, a frown came between her eyes, and as she watched his trembling hand place his cup back in its saucer. "You're ailing, Matt?" she said quietly. "Why don't you get back to bed and rest a little? There ain't so much that needs doing this morning." He shook his head. "If you ask me, I'm afraid the answer is yes, ailing. Ailing, it's no." He pushed his chair back from the table a little. "I think I'll go over and ask Turner to drive to Newton with me this morning. I want to talk to him and to some of the men down there as knows this workman." "Will you stop at Birdo's, Matt?" she asked tensely. His fingers clutched at strands of his beard, as if it were necessary to hold on to something. You'd have me to do it, wouldn't you?" She nodded. "We've held it against him that his boy stuck a knife in our hearts, but now he's grabbed a second knife that was aimed at us. Mother," he turned toward her with his eyes full of despair, "if you could have knowed back in 1830 of all the griefs you'd have—" She put a hand out to him quickly when he paused. "Your spirit needs bolstering today, old man," she smiled at him. "You know good and well I wouldn't have believed any prophecy. If I had, I reckon I'd have risked it. I wanted Matt Creighton for mine awful bad. If you are of mine to remember." They were silent again, each of them preoccupied and troubled. Upstairs they heard Jenny, in her room, getting dressed to come down to the kitchen. There was no sound from Jethro's room. "Let the boy sleep," Matt said after a minute. "Yesterday was too much for a lad of his years." "I'm glad that you are willing," she answered. "I don't want to be a soft mother because he's my last, but it would hurt me to deny him his rest this morning." They got to their feet, and Ellen began to gather up their cups and saucers while Matt pulled on his jacket and cap. "I aim to walk over to Ed's now," he said, and she nodded absently. A minute or two later, she thought she heard a noise at the gate, and hurrying out she found him lying unconscious on the ground with one hand clutching at his left side. She covered him with heavy comforters while Jenny ran to Ed Turner's for help. Then, between them, they got Matt to his bed. The oldest boy drove over to Hidalgo for the doctor. Matt revived, but the vigorous, erect Matt Creighton was gone. A man who looked 20 years older had taken his place. If someone had asked Jethro to name a time when he had left childhood behind him, he might have named that last week of March in 1862. He had learned a great deal about men and their unpredictable behavior the day he drove alone to Newton. Now he was to learn what it meant to be the man of a family at 10. He had worked since he could remember, but his work had been done at the side of some older member of the family. When he had grown tired, he was encouraged to rest, or sometimes he was dismissed from the task altogether. Now he was to know labor from dawn till sunset. He was to learn what it meant to scan the skies for rain while corn burned in the fields, or to see a heavy rainstorm lash grain from full, strong wheat stalks, or to know that hay, desperately needed for winter feeding, lay rotting in a wet quagmire of a field. By the second week of April that year, the fields were dry enough for plowing, and Jethro, full of the optimism of inexperience, harnessed his team and went out to the field alone. Ed Turner, driving past on his way home from town, stopped and waited until Jethro could get from midfield up to the fence row. "You can count on me for whatever help I can spare, Jeff, and whatever counsel. You're young for what's ahead, and I don't like to see a boy made a man too soon. I reckon, though, that it was right you'd be the staff of your pa's old age." Jethro flushed, proud and embarrassed at the same time. "I reckon I can manage," he said in his slow way. Ed hesitated, and then, pointing to the newspaper on the seat beside him, "There's been a bad fight, Jeff, down in South Tennessee." "Grant's army?" Jethro asked quickly. Ed nodded. "At a place they call Pittsburgh Landing, somewhere down on the Tennessee River. Grant let himself get surprised by the Rebs. Papers say that it was Sherman and Buell as saved things. They say it was a victory for us, but they're down on Grant. Make it sound like he's next of kin to Jeff Davis. 2 months ago, they was yelling and praising him to the skies after Donelson. I know, it's a sight easier to be a general in a newspaper office, I reckon, than it is to be one out on the battlefield. I'm not losing my feeling for old Grant, not yet. I ain't. The fighting, it was bad, was it?" Ed understood his meaning. "Upwards of 20,000, Jeff. More than 12,000 of them was our boys. Jethro looked up at the neighbor thoughtfully. I reckon we'd best not tell Pa, not till we hear from Tom or Eb. It would be better that way, Turner agreed. You and Jenny can read the papers off to yourself somewhere. Don't talk about it before your Pa. Or your Ma either, for the matter. Pa don't ask about the news these days. That's one way he's so different. Jethro was troubled. How long do you think it might take a letter to get from Tennessee? He asked after a while. It's bound to take a spell. I wouldn't worry, was I you. You'll be hearing from young Tom or Eb before long. Remember the fight at Donaldson was a bad one too, and both the boys come through without a scratch. I don't doubt, but you'll have a letter one of these days. Sure hope so. Jeff turned slowly back toward his team. His thin shoulders stooped a little. He did not weigh more than 80 pounds. Ed Turner must have been sharply aware of the look of frailty about the boy in contrast to the great plow horses and the wide fields where Matt, with his 4 boys, and Shadrach Yale had worked only the year before. His eyes were troubled as he made ready to drive on. Now spare yourself every hour or so, Jeff. Don't drive too hard. I'm going to send one of my boys over to help you before long, and some of the men over toward Hidalgo. They'll load to give you a day's work now and again. Your pa's got plenty of friends around here in spite of all the workmen's and their kind in the country. One afternoon later in the week, Jenny had hurried with her housework and was prepared to go back to the field with her brother. One of us can take a furrow or so while the other one rests. We'll save each other a sight of wear and aching by day's end, she told her mother. Ellen nodded without speaking. She watched them as they walked off to the field together, and then turned slowly back to sit beside her husband. They're good young'uns, Matt, she said. He cried very easily in his weakness. I've been thinking of young Tom, he said after a moment. I know, I think of him too. Him and all the others. We've been hearing from some of them soon. You're not to fret, Matt. We mustn't give trouble a shake before it throws its shadow. He closed his eyes and did not answer. He was suddenly old and weak, not himself anymore, but rational enough to know that several troubles had already thrown their shadows. Out in the field, Jethro and his sister were able to escape for a while from the gloom in the cabin. April was in full bloom, and they were young enough to accept the sunlight and color of new spring as omens of good fortune. They liked being together, and in the early afternoon, before he grew too tired, Jethro would walk along with Jenny when she took her turn at the plow, preferring conversation to solitary rest. I can't quite see how they're calling it a victory, he said, his eyes fixed on the ground as they walked along the furrow. If we'd got down to Corinth and pushed the Rebs out, that would have been good news. This way, looks to me like all we'd done was to keep the Rebs from having a victory. Anyway, we held on, Jeff. They can't say that our boys was puny alongside of theirs, like they said about us last year at Bull Run. What I wonder about, though, Jenny, is why Grant would have had known that the Rebs was fixing to attack. I think about it over and over. Why didn't he be more careful? Are you going against Grant like all the papers, Jeff? No, I ain't. Things went against him. Buell was late in getting more soldiers to him. That Wallace feller got himself lost in the woods right when Grant needed him bad. If things had happened a little different, maybe the papers wouldn't be singing a different tune about Grant. They're saying now that the president ought to fire him. I wonder why it is that folks are so ready to be down on Grant. Even Shad wasn't exactly firm the way most folks was after Donaldson. I don't doubt that it's because of that awful name, Ulysses. You know that name, the name I like, Jeff? Don Carlos Buell. If ever I have a little boy, I aim to name him Don Carlos. Jethro looked at her with mingled astonishment and disapproval. Jenny, sometimes you're so foolish I'm surprised that Shad ever took a liking to you. Jenny produced deep dimples in her hot cheeks. You and Shad are much alike, Jeff. Too sober and solemn for your own good. Sometimes you make me think you're a little old man with a boy's body. You and Shad, both of you need a foolish girl around the jolted corners of your mouths into a grin once in a while. He was pleased to be compared with Shad, and he walked for a while in silence as he thought it over. Then Jenny spoke again, and he was surprised at the change in her voice. I'm thinking about the battle too, Jeff, and the boys, and maybe Bill on the other side. There's lots of thoughts deep inside me. I ain't just as foolish as I seem sometimes. I know it, he said gruffly. They worked together often during the following weeks. Ed Turner's oldest boy came over to help every few days, and during 1 week 3 men from neighboring farms came over and put in a day's work. Jethro appreciated their help, but he was always glad when it was Jenny who went with him to the field and talked of one thing and another and sometimes made him laugh. The difference in their ages seemed to have narrowed that spring, and suddenly he stepped out of the role of a petted little brother and became a peer of Jenny, with the full rights of teasing or criticizing that had belonged to Tom a year ago. But Jethro was to experience one attack of childish fury before the transition to his new standing was fully accomplished. It happened with the arrival of a letter from Shadrach Yale, and it was very painful. The day had been, up until the noon hour, one of more optimism than they had known that month. Matt was much better, well enough to come to the table that noon and to listen with interest as Jenny and Jethro told him about the progress of the farm work. Ellen's face was full of relief, and she had stopped long enough in the midst of washing, cooking, and weeding her garden to gather a bunch of lilacs from the hedge and to place them in a small stone jar on Matt's plate. Jenny and Jethro were cheerful as they made their plans for the afternoon. She, with the help of Ed Turner, would finish the planting in the field south of Walnut Hill. Jethro would go on with the plowing down on John's place himself. They ate with the hearty appetites of youth and health and accepted with satisfaction the few quiet words of praise that Matt had for them. That praise in itself was something new. Matt had always demanded hard work from his children. It was a duty imposed upon them by necessity and by a pioneer philosophy, and praise was neither given nor expected. Now the necessity was greater than ever, but a changed man imposed the labor. The older children of the family would have been surprised and, according to their several natures, pleased or outraged by their father's consideration of these two younger ones. Israel Thomas brought the letter from Hidalgo, while the family still sat at the table. Jethro ran out to the road to take it to report his father's improvement in the state of the farm work in general. Israel handed the letter over with a marked lack of enthusiasm. "Hoped I'd be bringing your pa a letter from young Tom," he said sourly. "This here is probably nothing more than some sweet talk for Jenny from the schoolmaster. Well, here it is. Tell her not to believe more than half of what is written in it." Jethro took the letter inside and handed it to Jenny with a big smile. It was addressed to her, of course, but that didn't matter. He settled down happily to wait his turn at reading it. There had been other letters from Shadrach since he left in February, but as if determined to obey Matt's ultimatum of no romance with 15-year-old Jenny, the young soldier had addressed himself to the entire family. Spring, however, had reached a training camp outside Philadelphia, and it was as soft and gentle as the spring had settled over southern Illinois. Perhaps some mood of defiance for his future father-in-law had welled up in the heart of a lonely boy. At all the events, this was a love letter, and it was all for Jenny. When his sister left the table and ran off to her room with the letter, Jethro was irritated but tolerant of her rights. However, when she returned with flaming cheeks and began to read a few excerpts from the closely written pages, he was dismayed. He wanted to study every line, every flourish of the beloved hand. He wanted desperately to know every word that had been traced by Shadrach's pen. Letters were so few, and on every other occasion that Jethro could remember, any letter received by one member of the family had been read and discussed by every other member. That was courtesy, common decency, whatever one wished to call it, and now came this one, as precious a letter as had ever been received, and there was Jenny reading a line here and there, pausing to blush and most obviously skip over an entire paragraph, sometimes flipping over a whole page without sharing a single word. "Tell Jeff I take great pride and pleasure in hearing of his study of the newspapers." Blushes and a sudden stop, then again. "When I remember the long hours of my illness with typhoid, and the loving care with which your mother watched over me, I feel that I do indeed have a mother who replaces the one I lost as a child, and it is my fervent hope, dear Jenny." It was soon evident that she was not going to read Shadrach's fervent hope aloud, and Jethro, full of hot anger toward her, was amazed that his parents were tranquil and undisturbed. They even glanced at one another and smiled a little. Jethro had no smiles, not in his heart or mind or on his lips. "I would as soon eat something wonderful good in front of her and just offer her a crumb," he thought bitterly. He set his lips firmly together and got out of the room as soon as possible. It helped a little to have hard work facing him. He harnessed his team and rode away toward John's place without glancing back to wave goodbye to Jenny. He was in no mood to be gracious to anyone, much less to Jenny. His rage stayed with him for a while as he walked behind the horses back and forth along the length of the field. "She ain't ever been selfish before," he thought as he rehearsed Jenny's fall from his favor. Then, remembering a lesson from Ross Milton's book, which he and Jenny had been studying together when they had a little time, he tried fitting his angry thoughts into better English. "She's never been selfish before," he amended, and some of his anger was dissipated before the satisfaction of his new learning. In the middle of the afternoon, Nancy came down to the field with her children and waited for Jethro in the shade of a big oak tree just inside the fence row. "We brought you a little something to lighten your work, Jeff," she said in her quiet way. She held in one hand a slice of freshly baked white bread spread with butter, and in the other a stone jug filled with cold milk. He threw the lines over a post and sat down in the shade of the tree. The children came and sat close to him. He paid more attention to them lately, knowing that it pleased Nancy and they had grown fond of him. "They take you for a man full grown, Jeff," Nancy said, smiling. "I wouldn't doubt but what they sense something of John about you." He took a long, appreciative drink from the milk jug. "This is real nice, Nancy," he said, wiping his mouth and nodding to her. He was more at ease with her lately. She was beginning to seem more like one of the family. Her eyes were big in her thin face. "Has there been any letter up at your place, Jeff?" "Just one, from Shad. Nobody gets to read except Jenny." His voice was curt. Nancy watched his face thoughtfully. "He's still in training, I reckon. Him nor John would be in the fighting yet, would they?" "No, it's too soon. It takes a spell to get the hang of soldiering, I guess." He offered a bite of bread and butter to each of the children. It would be just as pleasing to him, he thought, if she questioned him no further about Shad's leather. He ate the rest of the white bread soberly and watched his two young nephews run a little way down the furrow, their small white feet pretty against the brown waves of the freshly plowed earth that lay sleek and glistening in the sunlight. It was April again. April. Jethro liked the sound of the word. He thought how beautiful it would sound in poetry. "Did you ever think how nice the word April sounds, Nancy?" he asked after a while. She smiled a little. "It does have a nice sound, Jeff. April's always been in my mouth, or my month. The month of my borning, the month of my marrying. But now," she sighed and turned toward Jethro earnestly, "and you're studying with Shad? Did ever you hear of this place, Shiloh?" He shook his head. "It's no town, I guess, just a little church near Pittsburgh Landing that got caught up in the midst of all the fighting." Nancy was like mother, he thought. One couldn't tempt her away from the sadness within her. "I couldn't sleep after I read the papers Jenny brought me. I kept thinking of the two young boys, and Bill, and of John being in battles later on. I thought the night was going to go on forever." She broke off suddenly and sat looking out across the quiet field, her hands folded in her lap. "What do you suppose it was like, Jeff?" He shook his head. "It must have seemed like the end of the world had come," he said soberly. "For thousands it hadn't it?" He nodded and felt ashamed that his anger over Shad's letter had made him forget the battle and the thousands of boys lying on the ground at a place called Shiloh. Ed Turner had said, "You can't expect to hear from the boys for a while, Jeff. Think what a job it's going to be to clear the battleground." Jethro pushed the thoughts back in his mind. He didn't want to talk to Nancy about things like that. He knew that it was a time to be getting back to work, but when he started to get up, Nancy stopped him with a quick gesture. "Sit a minute longer, Jeff. There's something I feel bound to say to you." He looked at her with surprise. "What's this thing that's on your mind?" he asked, settling back comfortably against the tree trunk and looking up at small segments of sky that appeared here and there through the canopy of green leaves. Nancy hesitated, and when she finally spoke, her words came slowly as if she were feeling her way with caution. "You mustn't hold it against little Jenny that she keeps her letter to herself, Jeff. A letter is kind of close thing. It's somebody's words that are writ only for you. It's like you're being unfair to someone you love if you let his words be read by others when he read them only for you." Jethro frowned and stared at the blue patches above him without comment. "Sometime you'll know what I mean," Nancy continued. "Likely there's some little gal, maybe one not yet born, that'll write to you someday, and every word she writes will be yours. You'll feel that you can't bring yourself to share them words because they won't belong to anyone but you." Jethro shifted his position uneasily. He picked up a small stone and heaved it into the weeds in front of him. "I doubt that," he muttered. "I don't care nothing about any girl. When you was 6, I guess you had doubted that soon you'd be managing a team and plowing by yourself. I guess you had doubted that by the time that you was 10 you'd be working to put food in the mouths of your brother's little ones. Ain't that so, Jeff?" "I reckon." She placed her hand on his knee for a second. "I'd best let you get to your work and go back to my own," she said. She called the children and got slowly to her feet. "John used to want me to talk more to the folks around me. It was hard for me to do it then. Now, it seems when I find someone to talk to, it's all I can do to make myself go back to the stillness." Jethro was exhausted by that night. Jenny came out to the barn lot when she saw him dragging home with the tired team. "Go eat your supper, Jeff. I'll unhitch and water the horses for you." Jethro was not yet in the mood approaching perfect sweetness and light. "Tending a team's a man's work," he said grimly. "I'll do my own hitching and watering." "I've been sharing a man's work, don't forget that." Jenny's dark eyes flashed with quick anger, but they softened as she looked at his thin body sagging with fatigue. "No use in being stubborn as a mule just because it becomes easy to you, Jeff." She started undoing the traces and tossed her head at him. Go on up to the house, young man. I got in early and made a nice pudding for your supper. You're lucky to have a sister that is one of the best cooks in the county. Don't you ever think you're not?" Oh, she was in a gay mood, that Jenny. The words in Shad's letter had no one else had a right to read must have been extra fine. Jethro shrugged ungraciously and went up to wash himself at the big iron kettle beside the kitchen well. The cool water felt good. He splashed it behind his ears and on his face and neck. He remembered once when Tom and Eb were washing at the kettle, and they had splashed him with cold water when he came to wash them. He had cried then, being pretty young, and the big fellows had called him a baby. He remembered that he'd felt strange and lonesome when they teased him. But suddenly Bill was there, and Bill had said, "I don't know whether it's more babyish to cry or to tease a little fella." Tom had tried to make it up to Jethro later. It may have been the gift of an apple or the right to sit in front of the saddle that evening when they rode off on some errand. Jethro couldn't quite remember, but whatever it was, Tom had been extra kind to him. He hoped that they'd get a letter soon from somewhere down in Tennessee. Jethro was not able to read the paper after supper that night. He was tired to the bone, and he climbed off to his bed in the loft as soon as he finished the pudding Jenny had made for him. He was sound asleep before the spring night was quite dark, but excessive fatigue, like excitement, was a forerunner of the nightmares that had plagued him for the past year. It was not quite midnight when some frightening dream made him cry out, and now that Bill was no longer there to comfort him, it was Jenny who ran from her room to sit on his bed and speak comfortingly. "Maybe you drove yourself too hard today, Jeff. I guess you've made yourself overtired." "I'm all right," he said after a minute. "You don't have to stay here. I'm awake now." "You're mad at me, ain't you, Jeff?" "I'm not mad at anybody. I'm just sleepy," he answered shortly. "The reason I didn't pass my letter around, Jeff, well, you know how Pa is. He thinks I'm so young and hadn't ought to think about getting married, and Shad said some things. I don't care about your letter. I don't want to read it." "But you can, Jeff. I'll let you read it. Nobody else, just you." "No," he said, turning his head away from her. She was silent, and he suffered during the silence, knowing that he had hurt her. Finally, he reached out and touched her hand. "I don't want to read words that was writ just for you, Jenny. That ain't right. Me and Nancy and I talked about it some this afternoon." Jenny bent and kissed his forehead. He did not mind, really, but he was a little embarrassed. "You can go back to bed. I ain't worried about my dream now." As Jenny was leaving, she stopped for a moment at the open door where a ladder led down to the dooryard. "Do you hear horses, Jeff?" she asked in a whisper. He sat up in bed listening. The sound was faint at first, but after a short time they could hear plainly the beat of hooves on the hard-packed road. It had not been unusual in other days when the country was full of young men to hear riders late at night, but there were few young men left in the community now. Moreover, at this season, more horses were being used in the fields, and at this hour of the night were quietly grazing or resting after the long day's work in the fields. "It's 2 or 3 horses galloping together," Jethro said in a low voice. He shivered a little. There was something ominous in the hoofbeats. He heard his parents stirring downstairs. Jenny's hand clutched his, and he could feel it trembling. At about a quarter of a mile from the house, the galloping hoofbeats quieted suddenly. Shortly afterward, the 2 watchers at the cabin could see the dim outline of 3 horses carrying men who seemed to be crouching close to the horses' necks. There was a fearful stillness about their approach until they were within a few yards of the gate. Then there was a sudden wild shout, and a horse reared as if in the fright at the sound. Jethro heard someone shout his father's name and Bill's, and the word "Copperheads." Matt fumbled his way to the front door. Show your faces," he called. "Come up and give me a chance to talk." There was only raucous, drunken laughter at his words. A bundle of something was thrown at the gate, and then the riders galloped on. Jethro scrambled down the ladder and ran out into the yard. At the gate there was a bundle of switches tied together with a cord, the symbol adopted by local ruffians as a warning of punishment to follow. He tore off the paper that was attached to the cord and carried it inside to the table where Ellen had lighted a lamp. On the paper, in large printed letters, was the message: "There's trouble for folks that stands up for their Reb-loving sons." Matt sat down heavily in the chair Jenny brought for him. "This war is a beast with long claws," he said in a choked voice. They were all silent for a minute. Then Ellen went to the door, lifted the gun that was held on hooks above the casing, and laid it carefully on the floor beside the bed. During the next 3 weeks, someone lay out in the yard with a gun at his hand every night. Israel Thomas came, and his son-in-law, Henry Giles. Ed Turner and his boys took turns. Sigurd Nelson from out toward Old Granville and Irv Chandler from Hidalgo volunteered a night each week. The greater part of the community was enraged that a sick man should be thus tormented, and they hoped the night prowlers would soon show up to get a taste of what Matt Creighton's neighbors thought of them. That was the feeling of the greater part of the community, but not all of it. Some men turned their backs when Matt's troubles were talked about in their presence. One man said to Israel Thomas, "How do I know it wasn't Bill Creighton's bullet that shattered my boy's leg at Pea Ridge?" "It wasn't Matt's bullet," Israel Thomas retorted. "Nor was it young Tom's or Ebb's or John's. No, but like they are saying down in Newton, Matt's young and made it plain that the family still sticks up for Bill." Nancy, frightened at being alone, came up with the children to sleep in Jenny's room each night. The two girls were up at dawn each morning to prepare a hot breakfast for the men who had lain out in the yard on guard during the night. When nothing happened during the rest of the month, the men decided that the switches had been an empty threat. It was the peak of the planting season, and the nights spent on the hard ground took their toll of men whose endurance was needed for the hard daily work in the fields. They cautioned Jethro to tie the dog up near the cabin each night so that he might warn the family of anyone approaching, and Ed Turner brought up an old dinner bell, which he attached to a post close to the kitchen door. "If there's any trouble, you ring this, Jeff. Some of us is bound to hear it, and we'll come," Ed promised. None of the Creighton slept well at night for a while, until exhaustion overcame their anxieties. Jenny's face was drained of some of its rich color these days, and Jethro's had a grayish cast under his bright hair. The dark was a fearful thing, but as the hours of the night wore on, sleep came to them anyway. They would just have to meet the attack if it came. They had no strength to lie and worry about it. As the days passed, the family's fears began to be allayed. Not even the disappearance of the big shepherd dog gave them too much concern. Nancy's oldest boy, Billy, told Jeff that he had seen a man petting Shep, and when the man whistled, Shep went running after him. It was not unusual for someone passing through the neighborhood to coax away a valuable-looking dog. Jethro was annoyed at Shep's gullibility, but not particularly anxious. "He'll be back, Billy, with his tail between his legs," Jethro told the little boy. "He'll get homesick and find some way to get back to us, you'll see." But Shep didn't come back, and a few nights after his disappearance, Jethro was awakened by the smell of smoke and the crackle of burning hay and wood. When he ran to the door, he saw the barn enveloped in flames that leapt far into the sky. Hay, grain, wagon, harnesses, and plows were feeding them, and they were hungry. There was one condition that must have been a matter of charging for the arsonists. All the farm animals were turned out to pasture during the summer nights, and so escaped a fiery death. Ellen, the two younger women, and Jethro stood in the yard and watched silently. Matt wept as he leaned against the door casing. Israel Thomas saw the flames from his home a mile away, and Ed Turner had been awakened by the smell of smoke only minutes before he heard the ringing of the dinner bell. They and others came shortly, and they stayed throughout the night to see that the burning brands were not blown onto the roof of the cabin. When the barn was burned to a pile of glowing coals, the men asked Jethro to draw water from the stock well to throw around the edges of the coals. He was conscious of a foul odor when he emptied the first bucket into the kettle beside the well. It was coal oil. That was a kind of punishment favored by mobs and self-appointed judges. Coal oil in the culprit's well. It could cause him any amount of labor and anguish. It took little time or intelligence or skill, and it released most effectively the malice and spite of those who took punishment in their own hands.